We can call the meeting to order then, and I will not be voting on anything today, so you guys can vote. We need an action item to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
Second. And moved and seconded. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Oh,
So you just do it.
just do it. Yeah. And then we also need an action item to approve the minutes of May 19th, if we got a chance to read those.
I would make a motion for the minutes.
Second.
And moved and seconded. All those in favor?
But they do need a change, I think. There's a spot in there where there's a discussion point that I think is in the wrong part of it. Yeah, on page 6, right in the middle, remember Daniel Tillman raised a question of the difference in percentage increases in employee salaries. That's, I don't think that's in that spot. Seemed like that was a discussion point.
Under personnel committee
Right.
report.
Personnel
I think it-
committee report.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay. All right.
Maybe I'm wrong. But
No, you're probably, I'm sure
it
you're.
just didn't, when I'm reading it,
It doesn't fit.
that was one time my brain was connected.
Well, you
When I was
can-
reading the minutes, I just, I flipped it, I don't think that's what that was.
Okay.
So we'll move that short paragraph up under the personnel committee report.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay.
It's entirely possible that the issue came up at that point in time, but it does belong with, so there's no problem with moving it, even if that's actually where it came up in the course of the conversation.
Right, then we need motion to
I
approve
would
the,
make that motion.
with amendments.
Second.
All right, moved and seconded, and all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passes. Diane, thanks again for being our public. Do you have anything you'd like to say today before we get started?
No, I don't, other than thank you for your work.
So we'll jump right into the board training. We're going to do the records management primer first, and then the fiduciary training, because it flows better if you weren't here for that.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I guess I'll start this off by reminding you that last board meeting, we had a conversation, I think it was last board meeting, I guess I could look back and find out, about records and information management and retention schedule, and the specific issue brought to the board's attention and for your approval or comment at that point was the issue of going to electronic records as our official records for the retirement system. At the point that we brought that issue to you, we had been advised by the Secretary of State's office that really the thing that needed to be in place before we made that determination was a migration plan to keep that information accessible and current as technology changed. We needed to have a technology plan for how to update that to new formats and new technology over time. Subsequently, we have assigned an internal sort of staff committee on records and information management, which is myself, Darla, and John Noble, because legal, IT, and communications, and Darla is officially at this point our records manager. I don't know officially, but that's.
She is, yeah.
Right, where,
For all intents and purposes, she is. Not currently, yet.
So, as part of the process of our three-part working group, we've gone out and built notebooks on record and information management. We'll go over first the most relevant state statutes, and these were, I'm not intending to imply that the law and the requirements are entirely new, but the laws were substantially revised. If you recall, in the 2015 legislative session, it was House Bill 123. So there has been substantial Secretary of State's office, Department of Admin, modification of rules, processes, requirements, and that sort of thing. And so we're on page 22 of the handout. And let me just, if we go through some of these, it will sort of become apparent to you. So the first statute there is the Management of Public Records Disposal and Destruction provision, which is specifically pertaining to how agencies get rid of documents when they have met their expected lifespan or use as public records. And if they're not historical records are kept forever. So sort of specifically, if you look at subpart B, it says the requirement for executive branch agencies, which TRS is, shall manage public records according to the provisions of Title II, Chapter 6, Part 11, and the rules and guidelines established by the Secretary of State, the State Records Committee, and the Montana Historical Society. And so it's not necessarily all encompassed in statute, it's not necessarily all encompassed in administrative rule. The requirements are coming out, I don't mean to say piecemeal as if they're greatly deficient at this point, but they continue to evolve. So at this point, and we'll get to that in some of the guidelines from the Secretary of State's office. Now, we not only have to have a migration plan in place, we have to have our retention schedule in place, our retention and destruction schedule for our public records in place before we can, along with our migration plan, before we can adopt electronic records as our official records. And as we turn the page in a moment, you'll see that that is sort of one step in a very large process. So the primary, I put the protection and storage of essential records in here because that has a huge overlap with the portion of fiduciary training that we're going to do on cybersecurity issues. Essential records are already required to be included in our incident response plan. That was provided, that was the incident response plan last board meeting. So you've seen that part of the records management security process. So we have to identify all of our essential records specifically. I put that in here just as a backdrop for something we'll discuss in a while. So the primary provision that applies to public, to state agencies like TRS is 20-6-1103, agency records management duties. So each department head shall administer the agency's record management function and shall coordinate all aspects of records management function in accordance with procedures prescribed. So again, we're talking not about what's specifically set forth in statute or administrative rule, but what the Secretary of State's office, the Records Retention Committee, or that determines from time to time. So it will be, forever an evolving process. There will be refinement in that to the requirements made.
Denise, can I ask you a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
This is, the language in V there is very interesting. Those three establishments that add additional rules, being, the Records Committee, the Secretary of State, and the Historical Society. The Historical Society, have they given you specific guidelines about what kind of documents they want preserved forever? Or?
Well, I will tell you that what constitutes historical records are defined in the state statute.
Okay.
With some additional clarification both from the State Records Committee, the Secretary of State's office, and the Historical Society. So part of our process for the records management program will be to inventory the records, including identifying what are our essential records, what are our historical records, and making sure that they're archived or stored in the correct place if they are historical records. Historical records are archived by the Historical Society. So, yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible that we'll have historical records that we will keep in-house as long as we are still functioning, at least copies of them, because they're still useful for business purposes. Of course, we always have access to them at the Historical Society in any case. So, subpart 2 of 1103 is analyze records inventory data and examine and compare all inventories within the agency to minimize duplication of records. So that's one of the big issues with the new expectation for records management, is that there should be one data set, essentially. They shouldn't be duplicated in multiple places, statewide or certainly agency-wide. We have to review and approve records disposal requests for submission to the retention and disposition subcommittee. One of the issues, an agency, once it has its sort of full-fledged records management program in place, can get authorization from the records management committee to do its own records retention and records disposal planning, approval, processing. Not processing as in we're going to shred them ourselves, but until you have all the pieces in place, you have to have permission, approval from the records management committee to dispose of records. So we're going to have to do this inventory. We're going to have to identify the retention requirements for each type of document we have. We're going to have to identify its lifespan, when it can be disposed of, and then we're going to have that approved by the records management committee before we can give effect to it.
Denise, back up on number 2. That doesn't really imply that you can't have a backup data set.
No.
Okay.
Well, no, and in fact, for cybersecurity purposes, that would not, I mean,
Exactly.
yes. So frankly, that's a very good point, and something, I mean, that's, I love synchronicity, and that's one of the points here, is that cybersecurity protection, privacy protection of personally identifiable information, records and information management protocols, resumption of business processes, and, in one of Tammy's favorite wish list items, workflow processes internally are all dependent on sort of the same group of data and require redundancy, backup data, all those kinds of things. So no, absolutely doesn't, but.
So what do they mean then?
Madam
So
Chair.
we shouldn't have an image commit, so right now, what part of our problem is, we have years and years of files that have been actually imaged, so they're available electronically, but we're also storing the hard copy boxes.
The same one.
Yeah, now those electronic copies are backed up, regularly, and we have the redundancy in Miles City. If something were to go down in Helena, in theory, we should be able to pull everything up within a few minutes over in Miles City. But it's what sort of prompted them to kind of push on us a little bit, them being Secretary of State's offices. They're down there and they see all these boxes and they all say imaged files, and they're wondering, well, why do you have 2 copies?
I think they say imaged files, and our retention schedule on them says they're permanent.
Yeah.
So they're, with respect to that specific issue though, we won't be disposing of those records, and when we start talking about the inventorying process and the classification process, it'll become a little clearer about why we can't simply take those boxes now because they're imaged, not only because we don't have approval at this point for the electronic records to be our official records, but because, we have a lifespan for our records that's beyond, in some cases, because we're dealing with the lifetime of a member. So the useful life cycle of our records can be significantly different from the sort of flat retention schedule, suggestions that the state makes. So we have all of that analysis to do as well. We have to incorporate records management requirements into the agency information technology plan. I believe the technology plan is specifically the one that specifically includes the security requirements. I'm not sure about business resumption processes. I'm sorry, I can look that up, but I didn't verify that. We're dealing with all of these things, frankly, as sort of a whole body, because the process of identifying the data we have, where it's housed, who needs access to it, what its classification is, what its retention requirements are, what its security needs are, that sort of thing. Each one of these issues requires a sort of inventorying process. We're going to try to do them in one fell swoop. So, ensure all agency employees receive appropriate and ongoing records management training. When we start talking about fiduciary duties and cybersecurity related to fiduciary duties, you will certainly, with respect to cybersecurity concerns, employee training is a sort of preeminent concern. After considering guidance from the state records committee regarding records manager qualifications, officially designate a qualified agency records manager. I didn't put those specifications in here, but the secretary of, or the state records committee has issued its administrative rule or policy regarding appropriate qualification of a state records manager. Darla certainly meets those qualifications, and again, at this point, it's her position that we're anticipating. Her position that is our records manager. Under the law, the records manager is the place where things like requests for public information are supposed to come through the door and be managed. It's the person ultimately responsible for compliance with the retention schedules. I shouldn't say ultimately responsible, the whole agency is, but if there are questions from the state or from external people about records management issues, that position is expected to be the subject matter expert and the initial point of contact, essentially. On page 24, you'll note there's, and what this document is the broad overview on the Secretary of State's office website of a records management program. It is not by any means the totality of the information and instruction they have out there. It's just sort of the big picture. I think we sort of discussed last board meeting that that emails are now expressly identified as public records under Montana law. So we are working on processes internally and on a statewide basis, and John could provide more detail on the state initiative to make sure emails are managed properly.
Would you like me to?
I think it would be helpful.
Madam Chair, Board, members of the Board. Yeah, the state is looking at what's known as a capstone policy for records retention in email specifically. And the capstone policy, to sum it up, is instead of categorizing the data, categorize the position that the data came into, the individual. And the retention policies are defined and based upon the position of the job description. So in a nutshell, a director, agency director, perhaps a deputy director, would be considered historical data and never, the retention policy would be forever. Management level would have its own retention policy, so anybody that receives email in a management position, there'd be a retention policy for that email. People at a next level down, there'd be a separate retention policy, and if you could conceive of maybe 5 tiers of retention policy, at the lowest level being no retention policy, delete on demand for a task worker, a field worker, someone who just has a position that is deemed, categorized by the records committee as having this level of job description that we don't need to preserve their email as a historical record. if you just stop and think about it real quick, it kind of makes sense. Everything that comes into the director's email box from the standpoint of the state and records retention policy is a historical record. The flip side of that, of course, is everything that comes into the director's email box becomes historical record, which means if I send Sean something that said I had Subway for lunch, that becomes historical record. I mean, and you can see that no concept is perfect. The idea here is to try and get a handle on how do we actually efficiently manage email data, and to do it on a record basis with every message that's in a director's mailbox, trying to determine whether it's historical and who should be the determining factor. Is it up to the director to determine what's historical or not? Because there may be some disagreement. And so I guess I'm just trying to explain the concept behind a capstone policy. Is you establish based off the position what records retention is, and you just apply that across the board. Everything that comes into a level 1 mailbox is historical record, and we keep it forever. And everything that comes into a level 5 we don't keep. When the user leaves, anything that's left is deleted. The user is able to delete on demand. So that's the approach that the state's looking at. Darla has been in communication with the Secretary of State's office, and they're looking for soliciting information and feedback from agencies right now on what our opinions are, the rest of the state, on how we feel about a policy like that. I think they're trying to evaluate whether or not that would be something good for the state of Montana to apply. From an IT standpoint, from a technical standpoint, it simplifies things. From a records retention for historical purposes, you can see that there's possibility. I mean, that we're going to be keeping stuff that obviously there's no, notices that there's a sale going on at Penny's. Everything else is going to. Everything's going to be kept. So it's not perfect, but it's an attempted solution to a growing problem. Email's massive.
I'm sorry.
In the past, you guys have been able to delete, or have you handled your own emails?
Well, they certainly, it appears as if they're deleted. I don't know, John would know more whether they're actually retained somewhere for some period of time.
There's a short retention period on the Exchange server. Every user that has an Exchange mailbox, including you guys, if you were to delete something, could actually go back and recover items up to 30 days past deletion. And there's a method to do that through the Outlook interface or through the mail client interface. Currently, the state doesn't retain anything beyond that. It's purged. Anything over 30 days old that's in an Exchange deleted mailbox is purged. And that's just due to storage requirements. If we implement a policy like that, we'll be able to go in and apply to each individual mailbox on a policy based off that user's job description and say, this stuff gets stored here and never gets deleted. These people's messages go, and so we delete them after 10 years. And then, regardless of what the user does in Outlook or in their mail client, no longer has an impact. That data is being spirited off and kept away in a separate data store because it's been determined by policy that everything in that user's mailbox is retained. So it doesn't mean that the director can't delete out of his mailbox. It just means that it's not actually gone forever. It's stored away for historical purposes if that policy is adopted.
I'm sorry.
Madam Chair, members, John, may I ask you this? So as I understand what you're saying now, the requirement is going to be forever for directors to have those emails saved. That's conceptually an idea. I believe Missoula County has adopted a policy like that. It's something the state's looking at, and they're taking feedback. Secretary of State is accepting feedback right now from. What kind of a catalyst would generate actual observation from an outside agency of that historic email record, or is there an ongoing methodology where they can go in and look at that record at will without coming to you or somebody else in the organization here and getting a facilitation of those records?
There is no method for an outside agency to access any historical or email data right now.
Other than like a hacking effort? That's correct.
A records request is the only method to come through, as Denise described, to put in a records request for public information, in which case we'd go through and look at whatever current email archive is available. If there's no archive available, obviously there's nothing to search. So.
And a records request would generally be as the result of some kind of issue or problem.
Yeah, we see it.
It depends on who you are.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, sometimes you get public records requests just because you're, just as an example, and I think I've mentioned this before, most legislative sessions, most election cycles, we will get requests from the Montana Democratic Committee. Tell us all of the records or, information or communications from Steve Daines with the Montana Teachers Retirement System. And I'm not making that up, we actually did have that one. So, you will occasionally get public records requests for political reasons, for litigation reasons, that sort of thing. But and what, John described, I mean, you can see, and to answer Carrie's question a little, previously the law essentially was an email had the record value that the agency assigned to it. So if you didn't do something to make that record a part of that email record, a part of your permanent record or your business record or public record, it went away after it was deleted from somebody's mailbox and the backup period had run and those were no longer available from state ITSD. So, now it's sort of, and it's not that what you put in an email has never been important, it's always been important. But, those records don't go away now, and it's gonna be really imperative to communicate to employees and train employees on the importance of using their work emails for work purposes, and keeping, inappropriate content off of their state emails.
Can I
I'm
jump
sorry, yeah.
real quick here, just so everyone is aware of currently, say I have an email from an employer or to an employer or from a member or to a member, and that's really sort of a critical document. I mean, any of those emails are essentially, so what we do is we do save those off and there's a way to take your email and put it into FileNet as an image document. So we are keeping those. It's not like we're not keeping those permanent records that are emails that really are like a business record, because we are doing that and we've done that for years, and we'll certainly continue to do that. So like Denise is kind of, the point Denise is getting to, I think, is that we have a means to keep those, but those are the records we're designating. Now it's gonna be, everything else is also gonna be stored off somewhere and possibly, discoverable at some point, which, like you said, it's mostly just a training thing and getting down to the point where you're not getting using your work email address for something you sign up for, that you're getting the notification from Verizon or the notification from Wells Fargo or whatever, so that you don't have all these things building up.
Capstone, of course, is the sort of baseline technological record retention, email record retention capacity, but it is not our business standard for what constitutes a business record and what we do with it, as Sean pointed out. Where you all would stand in the Capstone classification hierarchy of employees, I'm not exactly sure, but I would guess that boards of trustees, boards of directors are probably gonna be at the high classification level, and that may put us back in the situation of communicating with you via state email, rather than your personal emails, so
Well, I guess your phone traffic will increase if this actually takes place.
Yeah, that's true, probably true.
Yeah.
And increased phone traffic might not be a bad thing. So in the next section on page 24, the managing public records, we're not gonna go over this in detail, but I want just to show you that those are the primary steps. Inventory, appraisal, scheduling, records retention, and disposal and destruction of records are then the four big subject matter hits for our records and information management program, and they're sort of detailed here. We'll talk more about the inventorying, and it's generally, I mean, it's substantially similar for all of the areas we have to apply an inventory to. So we'll talk about that in the fiduciary duties training section. Down at the bottom of page 25, then, the appraising records gives you a description of the categories, the appraisal categories of records that will then key to the retention schedule. They have 9 categories of records in their retention schedule, hundreds and hundreds of specific document, standard document designations with retention. So it's actually a fairly lengthy process back on page 25 at the bottom of inventorying records. It says, generally, when conducting an inventory, it is best to start at one end of each office and go through each piece of filing equipment one at a time.
I noticed that when I read that.
So they expect it to be a fairly complete and robust identification of your data resources, but frankly, for security purposes, it's necessary anyway, so. And I'm not intending to imply that we don't largely know where our data is. It's, going to be a matter of getting it down on paper. So at this point, the only policy that we really have on records management specifically is the request for public records and fees, the request for public records process and fees associated with those productions. I can't, tell you when we will come to you with, an overarching sort of records management policy, but we will probably get a little further in the inventory and appraisal process before we know exactly what that needs to apply. I mean, unless,
It seems like to me.
Yeah, it is. It's a pretty involved project, and there's going to be a big time commitment to really get through it the way you're supposed to get through it. With that said, the changes to the statutes, which is kind of driving all this, are fairly recent, and I don't think we're not like an anomaly where we're way behind. I think most agencies are probably in a similar position as we are, but we do need to work toward getting in compliance with the law.
Really, in fact, sort of the objective of House Bill 123, if you look back at some of the testimony, it was sort of the position of it was the objective of the whole effort, that these are not new requirements, but many state agencies aren't in complete compliance because there's not enough sort of structure and enough policy and procedure and guideline built around it for them to know really what to do. So that's why we had House Bill 123 largely.
Honestly, it was about politics, but
Yes, well.
if we're gonna be honest.
Okay, so I think unless there are questions on records and information management, we're ready to move on to fiduciary duty training. And I don't want to belabor the fiduciary duty training. As you are all aware, every year we go through the protection of protected, personally identifiable information, and we go through the ethics and conflict of interest policy and the annual disclosure statement required of the board members and TRS staff. That policy largely identifies the fiduciary duties applicable to you as the board of the teachers retirement system, the other positions internally that would be fiduciaries as well. But cybersecurity has become sort of an issue of primary concern for all kinds of entities, and certainly for public pension plans. And attached to that has been the concern for potential fiduciary violation actions attached to breaches of data systems, etc. So there's getting to be quite a body of information and recommendation and best practices out about how fiduciaries should be involved in and oversee cybersecurity programs and processes in order to meet their fiduciary obligations in this area and avoid personal liability for any bad things that happen. So it's always our effort and our interest to keep you protected as fiduciaries of the system, both by doing what we're supposed to do internally, but this is, I think, different from most other fiduciary violations, things like the prohibited transactions or conflicts of interest. While what those are might always change, how they happen truly does not. It's a sort of finite body of things that you need to be concerned about and deal with. Cybersecurity, of course, and you'll see when we start going through this, changes. I mean, we have to have a security program in place, but it has to be reviewed, monitored, and updated as necessary for what's going on in the cybersecurity arena. So keeping a best practice standard for cybersecurity is a little different than keeping a best practice standard for other fiduciary sorts of obligations. So you have in front of you, starting on page 14, this is our basic fiduciary duty primary training document that all of you have seen before, because when you become new board members, you've been advised of these requirements. It's in the board handbook that you're given, and we've gone through the training before. We just have not gone through this particular training on a regular basis now that we have the ethics policy and that in place. So I'm going to synopsize most of this because I want to, and we're not going to talk about the conflicts of interest provision. It's in here just for refresher and sort of, reminder. But we've recently gone through the ethics policy and we don't need to rehash all of that right now. So just again, very quickly, a fiduciary is somebody who is in a position of trust, holds assets for the benefit of another person. Those assets don't belong to the fiduciary, they belong to the beneficiary of the trust. And so the legal responsibility on the trustee, the fiduciary, is to handle those assets with the utmost care. And there's a quote from a case that attorneys are attached to that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, so I won't share it with you, but utmost care is close enough. Our fiduciary duties come from a number of places. Montana has a specific trust law. Up until the 2015 legislative session, it was quite clear that those provisions did not apply to the retirement system. Now it's less clear, but I believe we're in compliance with them in any case because they're not different than the fiduciary duties that arise under the Internal Revenue Service qualification standards or just from the common law of fiduciaries. So it's kind of recently, because of the Zabrocki case, we had an opportunity to sort of sit down and outline. I did, and Sean and I discussed all of the places where the fiduciary duties, what are sort of the common law fiduciary duties, actually are specifically reflected in our statutes. So we have a policy statement that has 3 points in it. We have, in a number of our provisions, the exclusive benefit rule or the duty of loyalty, the requirement that you expend assets of the trust only for the benefit of the beneficiaries and to pay reasonable administrative expenses of the system. In 4 or 5 places, I would say in total, our statutes and administrative rules are 50% reflect fiduciary duties of the TRS Board through the proper management and administration of the retirement system in conformance with those fiduciary duties. So it's kind of interesting when you tell people where our fiduciary duties come from or where they are contained in our statutes. It it's not clean and tidy, but it's all over the place. So I've added a little bit of information in the section that is what are fiduciary duties, where do they come from, and how are they enforced? Because it's important to know that the first place, that your fiduciary duties, and a fiduciary is somebody who exercises discretion in disposition of the assets of the trust. So the board members are clearly your constitutionally fiduciaries of our members. Other positions in TRS staff would be fiduciaries as well, to the extent that they're exercising discretion in providing benefits to members and that sort of thing. Their fiduciary duties are applied and enforced primarily through three mechanisms. Compliance initiatives of the fiduciary body. So this is what, when you go to the NCTR conferences and that, and they're talking about governance, that's largely what governance is concerned with, is how the board understands its fiduciary duties and participates in making sure that those fiduciary duties are met. Audits and other reviews for fiduciary compliance. So once again, because our statutes largely reflect the fiduciary duties of the board, our compliance audits done by legislative services, I think the compliance audits are done every 2 years, essentially, to some extent, are enforcing your fiduciary responsibilities. We can also be audited specifically for fiduciary compliance by the IRS to the extent of the fiduciary standards that are reflected in their compliance qualification standards. And then, of course, legal actions, which is the enforcement mechanism you never want to get to. So the fiduciary duties that apply to the TRS board, and I want to tell you, you can find 100 different titles. I make up statistics sometimes, but it's a much bigger number of titles of fiduciary duties than are actually sort of the common law fiduciary duties. So for example, the duty of loyalty, again, you use the assets only for the benefit of our beneficiaries and to pay reasonable administrative expenses. Under the IRS qualification standards and under ERISA, that's called the exclusive benefit rule. It's colloquially called the exclusive benefit rule. So the titles that were sort of the common law going back hundreds of years, descriptions of what fiduciary duties were, have sort of been brought into more current terms, but then they also mean all kinds of things. So the duty of loyalty, the duty of delegation, and the duty of care or prudence are also the big point as we move on to cybersecurity that you need to take from that is the duty of oversight. The board has a responsibility not just to know what the staff is doing, know what the business processes and that in TRS are, but to know enough about them to be able to oversee and that doesn't mean day-to-day business kind of thing. But you need to be conversant about the processes of the retirement system where it rubs up against your fiduciary duties, and you need to exercise your oversight authority. So, and that really becomes particularly important with respect to cybersecurity fiduciary duties. I'm going to hand out, I found it kind of interesting that the IRS now has a fiduciary statement out for public pension plans in general. I hadn't ever seen it before. It doesn't have a date on it. I'm going to pass this around, and John is going to, I don't know if anybody else is. Oh, I'm sorry, I may not have sent it. So just a little bit of background for a moment. in his conversation, I don't want to panic anybody or make you feel like you're imminently in danger of a violation of fiduciary duty claim because of cybersecurity issues. There's actually very little law on the point at this point. But of course, as hacking incidents increase and as the information obtained becomes more damaging and sort of more, broadly known and understood, so far what we have for the most part are shareholder derivative actions against corporations. At this point, the pending cases are mostly related to the Target point of service hack that occurred several years back. There are a number of derivative actions pending in court at this point on those complaints. So again, there's no specific law that we have to comply with. This doesn't represent a specific law we have to comply with. I'll tell you what this is in a moment, but I want to sort of outline for you what the case law means. The derivative actions, the shareholder actions, the fiduciary duties are the same. So fiduciary duties are fiduciary duties are fiduciary duties. It's not necessarily, they're scalable, so it's not necessarily that the TRS board is going to be held to the same standard that the Target board of directors is held to, but the best practices are essentially not different for a corporation the size of Target than they are for an entity the size of the teacher's retirement system. You have to, identify the same, manage your risk with respect to cybersecurity, just like Target does, just not as grandly, probably. So the case law and the commentary that's coming out around the cases that are pending. First of all, compliance with fiduciary duties is about process. It's not about outcomes. The case law that's out on fiduciary duties in general makes very clear that a board or a fiduciary can be relieved of liability or not be liable for very bad things that happen as long as they have exercised due diligence in their oversight responsibilities related to that subject matter. So again, that's what, we're going to keep you up to date on cybersecurity in TRS, so you're there. So courts have drawn distinctions between business decisions made by well-informed fiduciaries and violations of fiduciary duties. So in order to be well-informed, a fiduciary needs to be educated in the cybersecurity arena on cybersecurity issues in order to be able to adequately converse about and assess cybersecurity risks and risk management objectives. Act in good faith and pursuant to adequate education and staff and third-party expertise in undertaking a cybersecurity program. Review, approve, and oversee compliance and cybersecurity policies, plans, and staff education. Ensure adequacy of cyber attack response plan. Ensure adequate oversight and audit of third parties who provide service requiring access to data systems. We have a number of those, not as many as a lot of agencies.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just have to ask. This is a strange subject for me because you were so reliant upon the experts that we put our fiduciary faith in, and we really don't have any, I at least, do not have any genuine comprehension of the technological platforms that are reliable or dependable.
Right.
So how, has that case law ever come up where that responsibility begins and ends when you don't have the technical expertise to become considered competent?
Yeah, so you're not required to be a technical expert in data systems and cybersecurity, those sorts of things. You have to oversee a program that includes, and not necessarily technical expertise. We do obtain that and use it where necessary. We have had particularly related to the M-Trust project, we've had experts come in and do security testing on our public-facing modules, our wage and contribution reporting module, and our My TRS, our member access portal. We will, I'm sure, implement additional security evaluation, expert security evaluation processes. So the specific answer to your question is, that's what this is all about. You're not required to be a subject matter expert. You're required to know what's going on. We will do the process that identifies the data, identifies the risk, identifies what appropriate risk management processes are. You will receive that information through periodic cybersecurity trainings and updates, and you will, approve, or, I mean, like we do with all other issues related to the board's expertise and exercise of.
Act as a prudent person would.
Correct, absolutely. So that's, exactly. So that's precisely the position you're in. Again, the issue simply becomes that cybersecurity remains sort of a moving target, and it always will be. So it's one of the fiduciary, it is a fiduciary duty that certainly my recommendation is that, we plan an annual update. I think this particular board meeting, the strategic planning meeting, is probably the appropriate place to do it. Because, let's go ahead and take a look at the documents I handed out. It kind of becomes, now this is the cybersecurity framework. These are NIST standards. This is a program established by the National Institute for Standards. It's exactly what it is, but
standards of technology.
in technology,
Yeah.
right, okay. That the state largely adopts, frankly, with respect to IT processes and functions. This is the framework, and this is a framework that is actually, this is version 1.0. Version 1.1 is currently out for public comment. This is not technically applicable to us. This is applicable to entities that are part of critical infrastructure in the United States, and it's been imposed. It was, I believe it was imposed in 2010 by executive order of President Obama, and it was reissued by executive order of President Trump in May of this year, and that reissuance included a new segment with respect to privacy protection of PII. So once again, there, you see the cross-pollination, reasonable. I mean, it all everything is everything, right? So this framework does not apply to us specifically. We are not legally, we are not a party, we're not a required compliant party with respect to this framework under the executive order or under state policy at this point. So, but this policy lays out really a very prudent process, and as we go through it, you will see very similar to sort of the first part of it, very similar to the process we have to go through for inventorying our records and information, for our records and information management program. So what I have given you, this is a large document, but what I've given you is sort of the schedule, the graph that's the big topics, and then the next pages are the subparts of the first big topic, which is inventorying. So this gives you a better idea. But I do want to look at the first page for a moment, because I think it's important for you to point out, Sean said earlier, it's not that we're not compliant with these things. It's not that we don't do these things, as with most AAs, with respect to the Records and Information Management Program. Cybersecurity is the same way. You address the issue typically before you've entirely outlined the issue. So we do a lot of the things. We have implemented detection processes. We certainly have implemented protection processes. We certainly do internal awareness training annually with TRS employees. We have protection processes and procedures. We have access control. We have protective technologies in place. We're doing more in the detection arena and will be doing more in the detection arena. We have an incident response plan in place. So there will be some fine tuning to those things, but it is certainly not, I'm not wanting to leave you with the impression that this is a step at a time process and we don't have any of it done yet, because that's absolutely not accurate. We certainly have a recovery plan as well, because we're required under state requirements to have the security plan. So then turning to the second page, you see the identification, the first big category in the overall process. So you have asset management, identifying the data you have, the people you have, the information flows that you have, the facilities that need to be protected. So you are identifying your data structure essentially, identifying your business environment, our mission, our objectives, because again, the point is best practice standards are fairly uniform, but they're scalable. The reality is we don't have the need, we don't have the funds, we don't have the people, we don't have the wherewithal, frankly, to have the sort of data system security that the Department of Defense has, nor do we need to. But you have to address the same issues, but then it's about risk management. What is our specific risk and what are the appropriate steps for us to take based on our business processes and needs to do that. Governance, of course, is specifically mentioned here. That's your role and your responsibility in the process. It also relates to what policies and procedures we have in place, which of course the board will review and approve as those things come up. And end result is this is all about risk assessment again. It's not all about risk assessment, but ultimately what our process is about risk assessment. Now I will tell you that one of the things that we've contemplated, and it's part of, we have a response plan, but you know, one of the issues about having policies and procedures and response plans is people have to actually know how to implement them. You can say what's supposed to happen. If people don't have some practice, some practical experience in implementing that response plan, it probably is not going to be as functional as you want it to be if the time comes. So, you know, ultimately we will have desktop exercises we've discussed for implementing the response plan to make sure that those of us internally who are key people in that process actually know how to do what we're supposed to do under that response plan. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I don't wanna derail, I'm not sure exactly where you're headed next, but part of this was, did you, maybe I missed it, there are some kind of ongoing cases in this arena, right? And I guess the bottom line is what, for the board, what would they need to know is how can they be in compliance with the duty of oversight or the duty of, you know, care and prudence? I mean, it's not that they're, like, we've touched a little bit, you don't have to be the expert, but what is really their role? Is it gonna be annual training and annual?
Well, yeah,
annual,
absolutely.
Updates, I mean, can you touch a little bit more on
Yep.
that? And I think, did you say there's a sort of some ongoing litigation in this area or not?
There is ongoing litigation, but again, the litigation that's ongoing with respect to breach of fiduciary duties and cybersecurity are in the corporate arena, not in the public pension arena at this point. So again, but
I guess maybe expand a little bit more on what the litigation, what the implications of it are, because at the sort of the worst case scenario, can't they, a fiduciary can be held sort of
independently responsible,
Right.
correct. Well, and just to clarify that point, so in the corporate arena, what you have are shareholder derivative actions, which means a shareholder files a lawsuit on behalf of the corporation against the fiduciary, alleging that the fiduciary misconduct or failure to act appropriately resulted in losses to the corporation. So the shareholder brings the action, but the corporation is the beneficiary of the legal action. And it is about personal financial liability of the director for the bad consequences. So in the case of the cybersecurity breach in Target, they spent, I can't tell you how much they spent, but let's say millions of dollars. And I'm sure it was, you know, many millions of dollars to address the cybersecurity breach. So you also have sort of derivative loss of value of your shares of stock based on, you don't just have loss of assets of the corporation, you have loss of stock value as well, and I think that that's included frequently in derivative actions. We don't have shareholders, but I think you can look at our members as being significantly similar.
Well, the fiduciary responsibility is fraught with peril in the corporate world because a lot of those board members, of course, are highly compensated
Yes, they
as
are.
well.
Right.
So that, you know, the inherent situation here is probably less fraught with that similar peril.
Correct. And I would say is
We're making a lot of money.
$50 every quarter. We're gonna take it back. And once again, I don't think there's a lot of peril for you. This process, an annual refresher, your instruction to TRS staff to have a good and reasonable cybersecurity process in place, to identify what that looks like, to obtain expert advice and assistance where necessary, and frankly, I think we're already doing that. We're already charged with that by the board. I don't think any of us labor under any other.
Denise, can I ask
Yes.
you or John or anybody else that would like to respond, just a general question in terms of the potential long-range cybersecurity risk to our members? Have you conceptualized, if you were a criminally minded person, what would be the motivation behind the acquisition of whatever types of information might be available about our members? How could it be utilized in a negative way? What's the risk there?
Yeah, identity theft. I mean, whatever
Primarily.
use somebody would make of the, access to, because we do have bank account information, EFT information for our members as well, so direct theft of assets could occur. You know, I mean, the standard kinds of
There's all kinds of fraud.
Is there credit
Yeah.
card information on these files anywhere?
Credit card, there shouldn't be, but I think, you know, and I'm no expert in this arena at all, but you see, I mean, that where hackers make a living stealing personal, just your social security number and your name and selling it to other parties. So, John,
Madam Chair, members of the board, the individual records with bank account information, address, and enough information to actually complete identity theft.
Okay.
The last time I looked, which was 6-8 months ago, those records can go for as much as $50 a piece. Credit card numbers are highly valuable on the black market,
Right.
but bank account numbers with identifying information, social security number, huge. But if we look at the number of records we have in our database, and you can just generally put $50 per record on there, so it shows incentive. Yeah, it shows that there's at least enough incentive to justify the risk involved in attempting to get at that data, which means that we always have to be diligent on the fact that we know that we're holding data that somebody probably would very much like to get their hands on, given the opportunity to. I mean, I think we're holding enough information, even if it isn't credit card, we have enough information of value on that it makes it valuable.
Thank you.
And I think the reality is that whether or not anything terrible happens to one of our members based on a breach of a data system here, the fact is that it costs the retirement system, because everybody whose data was potentially taken in an improper manner is going to be concerned about where that data went. You have to watch what am I trying to say? Credit reports for a lengthy period of time. People are going to want to change their bank account numbers. People are, change their bank accounts. People are going to want you to help them make sure that identity theft doesn't happen to them. That's where cybersecurity insurance and that comes in as well. And the state does have a cybersecurity policy that has been tested by a state agency other than TRS and apparently performed quite well. So that is one of the requirements that a fiduciary is required to at least consider as well as cybersecurity coverage. That piece is covered. Once again, we have a lot of this already covered. It's a matter of putting it all down on paper and having you advised, knowledgeable, sign off on the policies, understand what's happening, be assured that we are engaging the appropriate expertise to do the things that need to be done in the cybersecurity arena. So, you know, as Sean indicated or asked, the question is, what's the implication to the board? The implication to the board is what a violation of a fiduciary duty always is. Potential personal liability for the financial occurrence, for the financial loss of the retirement system if you're not doing what you're supposed to do. But we're putting a program in place, a process in place where you should be totally alleviated of that fiduciary duty, because we're going to make sure you know what you're supposed to know and that you are appropriately trained and exercise your oversight responsibilities with respect to cybersecurity. It's one of those things that sort of frankly took me by surprise when I started researching this, because in a lot of cases you can simply decide that you're going to delegate the responsibility to Sean, and you know, your potential fiduciary liability or the potential repercussions of delegating the responsibility, sort of wholly delegating the responsibility, are fairly small. In the cybersecurity arena, it looks like that's not necessarily going to be the case. You have to know more than you have to know in a lot of other areas, what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Okay, I have one more question. It would seem then, would you agree with this assessment, one of our primary responsibilities then would be to properly vet the expert advice that we obtain. And it'd seem that future case law is probably going to come down to the process by which we go through that vetting.
Right.
Would that be accurate?
Yes, and I'll say I'm vetting in a couple of respects. As a financial institution, does vetting mean background checks for staff? Maybe it does. Does it mean more specific controls and the ability to audit our third-party contractors? We already have a third-party agent agreement that is essentially making our Alfred Mungsgaard and Associates, our actuaries, anybody that works for us, that helps us perform our business functions in a manner that requires they have access either to our data systems or to confidential information, to private information, they have to sign the third-party agent agreement. It places essentially the same burdens we're subject to on our third-party contractors. But, you know, do we need to have some process whereby we require more information back from them, require them to have cybersecurity insurance, which is difficult to obtain for small entities and can be very expensive, so there's a risk management issue to address. Do we need to have a process to go out and audit those entities for compliance with the security parameters that they've agreed to? All of those things are, you know, included in sort of a best practices. Again, it's scalable. You have to know what the risks are. You have to, so those are points of risk, proper vetting, and depending on who you're talking about vetting, then what's the appropriate risk management response to that?
Do we have
So-
insurance through the state?
Yes.
Okay.
Risk
Not
management.
specifically TRS, but through the state.
No. And in fact, we have inquired on a number of occasions whether we should have fiduciary coverage separate from the insurance coverage from the state, or whether we should have cybersecurity coverage separate from what the state provides. And there are many, many reasons, there's another one of mine made up. And, there are reasons not to go out and purchase coverage separate from what the state have, and it has to do with our sovereign immunity provisions under state law and limitations of liability provisions. And if you go out and purchase coverage, you may be deemed to have waived those sovereign immunities. So that's.
So going back to Dan's question though about the vetting our experts, you're not envisioning the board being the one that actually
No,
does
of
the
course
vetting.
not. No,
It's
no,
more
no.
a matter of the board understanding what vetting takes place, right?
Right,
Okay.
absolutely.
Because we do all
Right,
that right now.
absolutely.
Would it be our responsibility as a board to supervise the process inherent to the vetting, or?
No more beyond, the policy, approving the policy or the practice of how that's done, or delegating the responsibility to someone with, and again, you know, this arena is going to necessitate some policies be in place, and it's, you know, it intersects with the records and information management, it intersects with the resumption of business requirements and that sort of thing. So, there will be policies, that deal with the things, you know, we don't do vetting as far as employee background checks. Many state agencies do. I can't tell you what the proposals will be, but, you know, again, I guess we understand that you are expecting us to address the issue and to come to you with policy for approval, with, you know, documentation and information about what it looks like. You've seen the incident response plan. We have a lot of the other pieces in place. You know, for the most part, your responsibility is going to be to, just what we've done today, sit through training once a year and ask questions and make sure that things are being addressed appropriately.
So like for the background check, for instance, I know when I was hired by TRS, they did a background check on my position, but I don't think we do them on any of the other positions, or just so you're aware. I mean, maybe that's something we should do. Maybe it is for only certain positions.
I think as far as the background checks or that, that actually is sort of encompassed in this. It is not a piece we have in place right now, but as we work our way through sort of the best practice process, you know, we'll have those conversations internally and you know, and come to the board with proposals or recommendations for whether that's necessary, whether it's necessary for all positions, probably not.
Certain positions,
Yeah.
maybe, yeah. Like the IT manager position.
Too late.
That's usually the position.
I
we
so
start
much
with.
want to comment. But I'm gonna not comment.
So I'm, unless there are additional
Is
questions,
that the fiduciary coverage through the state of Montana, is that primarily to cover legal expenses for a board or something?
so I'm going to say that I don't believe that the state, it's been a couple of years since I posed the question, but I specifically posed the question about fiduciary coverage. Under state statute, you are employees of the state of Montana as TRS board members. The state self-insures its professional liability kinds of coverage. We have been assured by risk management that you are covered for fiduciary concerns through the self-insured coverage of the state. So again, it's one of the things where, you know, presumably the limitations on liability of the state for tort claims would come into play for any alleged fiduciary violations by our board members, and going out and obtaining separate fiduciary coverage, we've been advised would potentially cause a problem as maybe being seen as a waiver of those limitations of liability. So we are assured from the state that you are covered, that you're adequately covered, that you will be defended, because we indemnify all state employees as long as you're not, doing something far outside your, as long as you're not involved in prohibited transactions, self-dealing, that sort of thing. Those are the kinds of circumstances where the state's gonna take the position that that's not anything you were supposed to be doing, not anything, and we're not going to indemnify you for that, but.
So even though the board members don't actually touch member data or really get to member data ever, should they potentially be doing the annual training that we have the rest of the TRS staff do? We're all required to do it as employees, but we also have actual ties to the data.
Right. So just from the perspective of, a lot of the online training that the staff does every year has to do with, protecting from phishing scams and that sort of thing. So if you're using a state email, then it probably would be reasonable for you to go through that training, just from the standpoint of being knowledgeable about what training internal staff are getting and that sort of thing. It would be valuable as well. So yes, John and I have talked that is probably, I queried him whether the board was, so you may get that email when we all get it next time around. Not exactly.
The
We did it fairly recently.
The logistics of getting you guys access to the training will be the trick, so. But I'll have to work out the details of that, so.
Well, and that's not necessarily saying that it has to happen. Again, I think there's some evaluation to be done there. At this point, I don't think any of you are really using the state email, is that correct?
I have not been.
Some do.
I think mine's auto forwarded to my other email.
Yeah, mine
which
too.
I don't know if that's gonna be okay going forward, but.
It's probably okay, but if you're gonna respond to that, you probably need to use the real deal. In Dan and I's both case, probably, I don't know for sure about you, but mine is being forwarded to my business email, and that's further monitored by my broker dealer, so I'm not sure that's the best practice going forward.
No, and in fact, I will tell you that there's probably another reason you don't want to forward your TRS emails to your professional, particularly if you're not self-employed, and that's because under law, it's still a public record if it pertains to the business of the retirement system.
Yep.
And even if it's on your employer's data system, there have been legal actions where primary employers in this case have had to make their data systems available for discovery purposes.
Mine's not, mine goes to
Right.
Gmail.
Oh, okay. We should change that, Kelly.
Okay.
When they took access off our phones to the state system, that was the workaround.
Yeah, to send it.
So I don't really know how to get to state email now, because it used to come to my phone. So I don't know about responding. I respond on Gmail back to you, I guess.
You do.
Well,
they could do webmail, right?
There's a
Yes.
simple webmail.
Yeah, we can, I think you could probably print just a couple pages out on webmail.
Do we know if we should be doing that now, or should we wait and see if it's required at some point?
I think it's, I guess I don't feel like I can answer whether you should be doing it. It's very doable. I check my state email through a browser on my iPhone occasionally.
I think the problem was that I don't use it that often,
Right.
and the password has
That's-
to be
that will be a-
fixed periodically, and so I was locked out every single time.
That's correct, and that will be a continuing, as there's a 60-day policy on the password, and so every time you want to check your email, you may have to get a hold of one of us to get your password reset, so that will pose a imposition to you to do it.
Is there a process in that where they can use an old email or an old email password to create a new one?
It just-
As opposed to the state just flipping it over and now I don't know what it is?
No, if it's been a relatively short period of time, you should be able to reset your own password, initiating with your old one, and then putting in a new one twice through the Outlook for web access interface on the phone. If you haven't checked it in a very long time, that may be if the account becomes disabled, then it wouldn't work. So,
But there are no downsides that either one of you could think of to just forward it to a personal email.
Well, except that again, that's no different than it being your employer's email in that it's still a public record and your personal, you know, your phone, your laptop, whatever, could become a point of discovery, if it, you know. I guess at this point, I would say it's important that you communicate with TRS for the reasons that you need to communicate with TRS, that, you know, if you don't go out and check your state email and that, and you're doing something different at this point, other than if you're receiving your email on a different, you know, legal entity system, like your business system, you may want to change that, but taking, you know, forwarding it to your personal phone or your personal laptop or that, understand what the risks are, but it's probably more important that you have access to us and you receive those emails right now than it is that, you know,
Right, so
based on the
I
response.
monitor their mailboxes, and if, typically what happens, if there's something from someone they know or someone they ran into, and that they had a conversation that really requires them, you know, I will forward it to their personal email address, and then they respond back.
Yeah, and
It's not, you know, once in a while, if it's a TRS related question, that, like, you can tell they went out to the website and they got Dan's email address off the website, then I usually will respond to the inquiry and copy the board member. Scott and I had one with the gentleman at OPI a couple, about a year ago or so, yeah. So, you're right, I think the most important thing is we're able to communicate back and forth, and you're getting what you need, and I'm getting what I need from you in as quick as possible, but we may
Otherwise,
look at
know
it.
what the risk is and, you know, sort of assess that for yourself at this point, and as we.
Sean, just mail me a letter sometime.
Yeah.
So I think that's it, unless there are other questions. Again, you'll hear about cybersecurity once a year from now on. Or more often if necessary. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to.
I was going to say, unfortunately,
Hopefully it's only.
if we're fortunate, it will be once a year.
All right, well, we're to a break, so I'm sure everybody